A thief should kneel, the manager said, his voice sharp enough to slice through the low hum of checkout scanners and shopping carts. And in that single sentence, the entire supermarket seemed to hold its breath, as if the air itself had been pulled tight and frozen in place. Fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead, while dozens of eyes turned in slow unison toward the center aisle where an old man stood, or rather tried to stand, his frame thin beneath a worn coat that hung loosely from his shoulders like it had forgotten its original shape, his shoes scuffed, his hands trembling not with fear, but with something deeper, something quieter, something that came from days without food and nights without rest. And yet, even as the accusation hung heavy in the air, there was a stillness in him that did not match the scene unfolding around him, a stillness that didn't belong to someone guilty, didn't belong to someone broken. But no one seemed to notice that part, not the shoppers gripping their carts a little tighter, not the teenager holding up a phone pretending not to record, not the young couple who exchanged a quick glance before looking away, because it was easier that way. Easier to believe the label spoken out loud than to question it. Easier to move on than to stand still and see. And near the front of the aisle, Daniel Whitmore adjusted his tie with practiced precision, his posture straight, his expression controlled, the kind of control that came from years of believing he understood exactly how the world worked and exactly where everyone belonged within it. His polished shoes reflecting the sterile white floor beneath him as he stepped closer, not rushed, not aggressive, just certain, completely certain, the kind of certainty that didn't leave room for doubt or second chances. "You took something," he added, quieter now, but somehow louder, because the words carried weight, because they carried judgment, and the old man, Isaiah Brooks, lifted his eyes. Just slightly, not fully meeting the manager's gaze, but not avoiding it either, just enough to show he had heard, just enough to show he was still present, still there beneath the assumptions being placed on him, his lips parting as if to speak, then closing again, because sometimes words didn't change anything. Sometimes explanations didn't matter once a story had already been decided for you. And somewhere behind him a child's voice whispered, soft and uncertain, "Mom, is he okay?" Only to be met with a quick, hushed reply, "Don't look," followed by the subtle pull of a hand guiding her away. Because discomfort had a way of spreading if you let it linger too long, because empathy required time. And time was something people rarely gave in places like this. Places built on movement and noise and quick decisions. And the carts kept rolling, the registers kept beeping, but slower now, quieter, like everything was happening behind glass, like the moment had stretched thin enough to see through. And Isaiah shifted his weight slightly, the fabric of his coat brushing softly against his legs, his breathing steady despite the attention, despite the pressure, despite the invisible line that had been drawn around him, separating him from everyone else in the room. And Daniel took another step forward, closer now, close enough to see the faint lines etched into Isaiah's face, the kind of lines that told stories no one had asked to hear. And for a brief second, so brief it could have been imagined, there was something like hesitation in the manager's eyes, something that flickered and disappeared before it could take shape, replaced again by that same practiced certainty, that same belief in order and consequence. And above them the lights continued to hum, casting their cold, even glow across polished floors and stocked shelves, illuminating everything equally except the truth, because the truth didn't sit neatly on display. It didn't come with a barcode or a label. It waited, quiet and unseen, just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when someone would finally stop long enough to notice it. Isaiah did not move right away, not because he did not understand what was expected of him, but because his body seemed to weigh more than it should. Like every step carried the memory of miles walked under an open sky with no destination that promised rest. And for a moment he simply stood there in the middle of the aisle, surrounded by shelves filled with things people bought without thinking twice, things wrapped in plastic and labels and certainty, things that belonged to a world he had slowly drifted out of without anyone noticing, his fingers curling slightly at his sides, as if holding onto something invisible, something that used to be there. And when he finally shifted his weight, it was careful, deliberate, like he was choosing dignity over urgency, even in a place that offered him neither. His gaze lowering just enough to avoid confrontation, but not enough to disappear, because disappearing was something he had spent years resisting in quiet ways. in the way he still straightened his coat, even when it no longer held its shape, in the way he still spoke softly to strangers who rarely answered back, in the way he still believed that being seen as human mattered even when the world decided otherwise. And around him the murmurs began to rise again, low and scattered, a blend of curiosity and judgment that never quite formed into words anyone would claim as their own. A woman near the cereal aisle leaned slightly toward her companion, whispering something that ended with a small shake of her head, while a man by the refrigerated section glanced over and then quickly looked down at his phone as if the screen offered a safer reality. And somewhere behind the registers a cashier paused mid-scan, her hands hovering over a box of cereal, her eyes fixed on Isaiah with a look that was not quite pity and not quite understanding, but something in between, something unfinished. And Daniel remained where he was, watching, waiting, his expression unchanged but his stance firm, like the outcome had already been decided, and all that remained was for Isaiah to accept it. "Do not make this harder than it has to be," he said, his tone measured, almost calm, as if offering a choice that did not truly exist. And Isaiah's shoulders rose slightly with a quiet breath, the kind that filled the chest slowly and left just as gently, a rhythm learned over years of enduring moments that asked more from him than he had to give. And when he finally bent his knees, it was not sudden, not forced, but controlled, a gradual lowering that spoke less of submission and more of survival, as if he understood that sometimes the only way to move through a moment was to let it pass over you without breaking what remained inside. The fabric of his coat brushing against the polished floor as he settled, his hands resting loosely on his thighs, not clenched, not raised, just there, steady despite the tremor that still lingered in his fingers. And the room seemed to tighten again, the sound of carts slowing, conversations fading into the background, the air itself growing heavier with the weight of what everyone was witnessing, but few were willing to question. And Isaiah closed his eyes for a brief second, not in defeat, but in something closer to memory, as if behind his eyelids there was a place where he was not standing under harsh lights or surrounded by strangers, a place where his name was spoken with familiarity instead of suspicion, where his presence did not need to be justified. And when he opened them again, there was no anger there, no visible frustration, only a quiet steadiness that did not match the accusation placed upon him, a steadiness that suggested a story far larger than the moment unfolding in front of them. But stories required listeners, and in that aisle, beneath the hum of fluorescent lights and the watchful eyes of a passing crowd, there were very few willing to listen. Daniel Whitmore watched the old man settle onto his knees with a sense of order restored, not satisfaction exactly, but something close to it, the quiet confirmation that the system still worked the way he believed it should, that lines could still be drawn and enforced, that people still fit into the roles he had learned to recognize without question. And he adjusted his cuffs slowly, deliberately, as if resetting the moment into something manageable, something that made sense again, because uncertainty had never sat well with him, not in business, not in life, not in places like this where efficiency and control were expected to move hand in hand. And from where he stood, Isaiah Brooks was no longer a question, no longer a possibility, but a resolved situation, a problem identified and contained, his mind already moving ahead to procedures, to reports, to the quiet assurance that he had acted appropriately, responsibly, in the interest of the store and its customers. And yet something in the air did not fully settle. Something remained suspended just out of reach, like a note in a song that had not quite resolved. And Daniel felt it in the subtle shifts around him, in the way the employees were slower to return to their tasks, in the way a few customers lingered longer than necessary, watching without speaking, their expressions harder to read now, less certain. And he cleared his throat lightly, the sound cutting through the lingering quiet as he gestured toward a nearby employee. "Call security and have them document this properly," he said, his voice calm but firm, carrying just enough authority to remind everyone within earshot that this was still his space, his responsibility, his decision. And the employee nodded, quickly, stepping away with a sense of urgency that felt rehearsed, practiced, as if moments like this followed a script that no one questioned. And Daniel turned his attention back to Isaiah, studying him now not as a person but as a situation, as a set of visible facts arranged into a conclusion he trusted without needing confirmation: worn clothes, unsteady posture, presence without purpose. All the indicators aligning neatly into a story he had seen before and believed he understood. And still Isaiah did not speak, did not argue, did not attempt to reshape the narrative forming around him. He simply remained where he was, his back slightly curved but not collapsed, his hands resting calmly, his breathing even, as if the world pressing in around him had not yet reached whatever place inside him still held steady. And for a brief moment Daniel found that silence more unsettling than any protest might have been. Because protest could be dismissed, resisted, overruled, but silence lingered. It invited questions without asking them directly, and questions were not something Daniel welcomed in situations he had already decided. So he shifted slightly, redirecting his focus outward, toward the store, toward the visible, measurable order he could control. And near the entrance a pair of automatic doors slid open with a soft mechanical sound, letting in a brief wash of cooler air from outside, carrying with it the faint scent of rain on pavement, and a man stepped inside, his presence quiet at first, almost unnoticed against the backdrop of everyday movement, dressed in a tailored coat that fit with precise ease, his posture straight but unassuming, his pace steady as he crossed the threshold and paused just long enough to take in the scene before him, his eyes moving not quickly but carefully, as if he was measuring something deeper than what was visible. And for a moment he did not speak, did not step forward. He simply stood there near the entrance, his gaze settling on the center aisle where an old man remained on his knees beneath the sterile glow of overhead lights. And something in his expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable, like recognition finding its way through disbelief, like a memory surfacing where it was not expected, and the space between what he saw and what he understood began to close, slowly, quietly, until the noise of the store faded into the background, and only one image remained clear in his mind. And Daniel, still unaware of the shift taking place behind him, straightened his shoulders and prepared to continue, believing the moment was under control, believing the story had already been written, not yet realizing that the truth had just walked through the door. The man near the entrance did not move immediately, not because he was unsure of what he was seeing, but because his mind refused to accept it all at once, as if reality had shifted half an inch out of place, and everything needed a second to realign, and his fingers tightened slightly at his sides, not clenched, not tense, just controlled, the kind of control learned over years of navigating rooms where every expression mattered. Every reaction carried weight, and yet none of that training seemed to apply here, not in this moment, not with that image in front of him, because the man on the floor was not a stranger, not a passing figure to be overlooked, but someone whose face had been etched into memory long before titles and responsibilities had ever come into his life, someone whose presence once filled rooms with quiet strength rather than silence. And for a brief second the distance between past and present collapsed into something almost unbearable, and he exhaled slowly, steadying himself before taking a step forward, then another, his shoes making soft contact against the polished floor, each step deliberate, measured, drawing him closer to the center of the aisle where everything seemed to converge, and still no one noticed him fully, not yet, because attention remained fixed on the scene already unfolding, on the man kneeling, on the manager standing above him, on the invisible lines that had been drawn without question. And Daniel continued speaking, his voice carrying across the aisle as he addressed the employee who had returned with a clipboard, outlining details, procedures, expectations, his tone steady and composed, the tone of someone who believed he was maintaining order. And Isaiah remained where he was, unmoving except for the slow rise and fall of his chest, his eyes now open but unfocused, as if looking beyond the immediate, beyond the bright lights and the watching crowd, into something quieter, something that could not be touched by what was happening around him. And then the footsteps reached closer, close enough to shift the air slightly, close enough that a few heads turned instinctively, sensing a new presence entering the frame. And the man stopped just at the edge of the circle that had formed, his gaze fixed entirely on Isaiah, not on Daniel, not on the employees, not on the crowd, only on the figure at the center. And something in his expression changed again, deeper this time. No longer just recognition, but something layered with disbelief, and something heavier, something that carried the weight of years unspoken. And his voice, when it finally came, was not loud, not commanding, but it carried in a way that cut through the space without force. "Sir," he said, not to the manager, not to the employees, but to the man on the floor, the words simple yet loaded with something no one else in the room could immediately place, and Isaiah's head lifted slightly at the sound, just enough to acknowledge it, just enough for their eyes to almost meet, and for a brief second time seemed to stretch again, thinner than before, more fragile, like a thread pulled tight between 2 points that had once been close and had drifted far apart. And Daniel turned then, finally noticing the presence behind him, his expression shifting from control to mild irritation at the interruption, the kind of reaction reserved for moments that did not follow expectation, and he opened his mouth to respond, to reassert authority, to redirect the situation back into familiar ground. But something in the man's posture stopped him, something in the stillness, the quiet intensity that did not match the usual patterns he recognized, and the store seemed to hold its breath once more, the hum of the lights, the distant beeping of scanners, the soft rustle of movement all fading into the background as the moment pivoted, subtly but unmistakably, towards something no one had yet fully understood, and the space that had once belonged entirely to judgment and assumption now began to shift under the weight of a truth that had not yet been spoken, but was already beginning to make itself known. Daniel felt it before he understood it, the subtle shift in the room, the way attention began to drift away from him and settle somewhere just behind his shoulder, like gravity had quietly changed direction, and he turned more fully now, his expression tightening slightly as his eyes landed on the man who had stepped forward, taking in the tailored coat, the quiet composure, the kind of presence that did not ask for attention yet commanded it anyway. And for a brief second Daniel searched his memory, trying to place him, to categorize him, to fit him into something recognizable, but nothing immediate surfaced, only the growing awareness that this was not someone easily dismissed, not someone who belonged to the background of this scene, and the clipboard in the employee's hands lowered just a fraction, the pen pausing mid-air, as if even the act of writing suddenly felt premature, and Isaiah, still on his knees, lifted his gaze a little higher now, his eyes narrowing slightly as they adjusted to the angle, to the light, to the figure standing in front of him, and there was a flicker there, faint but undeniable, not surprise, not exactly recognition, but something that carried the weight of memory brushing against the present, like a name almost spoken but held back by time. And the man took another step closer, closing the distance with quiet certainty, his breathing controlled but heavier. Now, as if each inhale carried more than just air, carried years of distance, years of silence, years of questions that had never found their way into words. And when he spoke again, his voice was still calm, still measured, but there was something beneath it now, something that did not belong to the room or the moment, but to something far deeper. "Please, let him stand," he said, and the request hung in the air, not loud, not forceful, yet impossible to ignore, and Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the instinct to reassert control rising quickly. "Sir, this is an internal matter," he replied, his tone polite but firm, the practiced language of someone used to drawing lines and maintaining them. "We are handling a situation involving suspected theft," and the word lingered there again, heavier this time, as if repeating it would solidify its truth, and the man's gaze shifted briefly to Daniel, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with a quiet intensity that made the explanation feel smaller than it was intended to be. And then his eyes returned to Isaiah, and something in his expression softened, just slightly, just enough to reveal the conflict beneath the surface, and Isaiah's lips parted again, this time not to defend himself, not to explain, but as if searching for something else entirely, something that did not fit the narrative surrounding him, and the silence stretched once more, longer now, more fragile, as if the entire room was balanced on the edge of a realization not yet spoken, and a faint sound broke through it, the automatic doors sliding open again somewhere behind them, letting in another breath of outside air, cooler, fresher, carrying the distant scent of rain and asphalt. A reminder that beyond these walls the world continued without pause, without judgment, without labels, and yet inside, everything remained suspended, waiting, and the man stepped closer still, now only a few feet away from Isaiah, close enough to see the details others had overlooked, the lines etched into his face, the quiet steadiness in his posture, the unmistakable presence of someone who had endured more than the moment suggested, and his voice, when it came again, was softer now, almost unsteady despite his effort to control it. "Look at me," he said, not as a command but as a plea, and Isaiah hesitated for just a fraction of a second before lifting his eyes fully, meeting the gaze in front of him, and in that instant something shifted, something undeniable, something that did not need explanation, because recognition, when it is real, does not arrive loudly. It settles quietly and changes everything, and the space between them seemed to close in a way that had nothing to do with distance. While behind them Daniel stood frozen in place, the certainty he had relied on beginning to fracture in ways he could not yet name. The story, he believed he understood, no longer fitting the moment unfolding before him. And the room, once filled with quiet judgment, now held a different kind of silence, one that waited, not for confirmation, but for truth. The moment did not break all at once. It unraveled slowly, like a thread being pulled from fabric that had seemed whole just seconds before. And in that fragile stretch of silence Isaiah held the gaze in front of him, his eyes searching not for confirmation but for truth, as if the face he was looking at belonged to two different times at once, one buried deep in memory and one standing here, now under cold fluorescent light. And his lips trembled slightly before forming a word that barely made it past the air between them. "Nathaniel." Not loud, not certain, but enough, just enough to shift everything that followed. And the man in front of him exhaled sharply, as if something inside his chest had been released without warning, his composure cracking for the first time since he had entered, not outwardly, not dramatically, but in the small details, the tightening of his jaw, the slight tremor in his breath, the way his shoulders no longer held the same effortless control, and he stepped forward without thinking now, closing the final distance, dropping down just enough to meet Isaiah at eye level, not caring about the polished floor or the watching crowd, only focused on the man in front of him, the man whose name had once been spoken every day without hesitation, and whose absence had stretched into years that never quite made sense no matter how much success had filled the space left behind. "It is me," he said quietly, his voice no longer carrying the detached calm of before, but something far more human, something raw beneath restraint. "It is me, Dad." And the word lingered, heavier than anything else spoken in that aisle, heavier than accusation, heavier than judgment, heavier than the silence that followed. And around them the world seemed to stop. Completely, not metaphorically but in a way that could be felt. The registers paused mid-scan. The carts stilled. The murmurs disappeared, because something deeper than curiosity had taken hold, something that did not allow movement or distraction, and Daniel Whitmore stood motionless, the words not yet fully reaching him, not yet forming into something he could process, because the reality in front of him did not align with the assumptions he had built his decision on, could not align, and yet it stood there undeniable, impossible to ignore, and Isaiah's eyes filled, not with sudden emotion, but with something slower, something that had been building long before this moment, something that had waited through years of distance and silence, and his hand lifted slightly, hesitant, as if unsure whether the space between them was real or imagined. And when his fingers finally reached forward, they did not grasp, did not cling. They simply rested lightly against Nathaniel's sleeve, grounding the moment in something tangible, something real, and Nathaniel did not pull away, did not step back. He stayed exactly where he was, allowing that contact, absorbing it, as if it confirmed something he had not fully allowed himself to believe until now. And his gaze softened further, the intensity shifting into something quieter, something filled with questions that no longer mattered in the presence of what was already clear, and behind them a faint sound broke the stillness, the clipboard slipping slightly in the employee's hands, the pen falling with a soft click against the floor, a small, almost insignificant noise that somehow carried through the silence like a marker of change, and Daniel's breath caught as if he had just realized he had been holding it, his mind racing now, trying to reconstruct the moment, to trace it back, to understand how the scene he had controlled had transformed into something entirely outside his grasp. And for the first time since it began, he did not speak, did not issue instructions, did not correct or clarify, because there were no words prepared for this, no procedure for this, only the growing weight of realization pressing in from all sides. And in the center of it all, Isaiah and Nathaniel remained close, the distance between them no longer defined by years or circumstances, but by a single moment that had bridged everything without warning, without permission, and without leaving anything unchanged. The silence did not shatter, it deepened, thickened, settling over the room like something sacred that no one dared to disturb. And in that stillness, Nathaniel slowly rose to his feet, his movement careful, deliberate, as if standing too quickly might break the fragile connection that had just been restored, and his hand remained lightly on Isaiah's shoulder for a brief moment longer before he turned, not abruptly, not with anger, but with a quiet resolve that carried far more weight than any raised voice ever could. And his eyes found Daniel, not searching now, not questioning, but steady, clear, and impossible to ignore, and Daniel felt it immediately. The shift from control to exposure, from authority to something far less certain, and for the first time his posture faltered, just slightly, the confidence that had guided him moments before now feeling misplaced, misaligned with the reality unfolding in front of him. And he opened his mouth as if to speak, to explain, to justify, but the words did not come as easily as they had before, because the framework he relied on had already begun to collapse, and Nathaniel took a single step forward, closing the space between them with calm precision, his voice when it came low but unmistakably firm. He did not take anything, he said, not as a defense but as a statement, something absolute, something that did not invite argument, and Daniel blinked once, processing, recalculating, his mind searching for a response that would restore balance. "Sir, we have procedures," he began, his tone carefully measured, attempting to regain footing. "We observe behavior that raised concern, and in situations like this we are required to act accordingly." And even as he spoke, the words felt thinner than they had moments ago, less solid, less certain, because the weight of them no longer held against what stood before him. And Nathaniel listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, not dismissive, not aggressive, simply present. And when Daniel finished, there was a brief pause, the kind that stretched just long enough to make the absence of immediate response feel significant. And then Nathaniel spoke again, quieter this time, but somehow even more powerful. "You saw what you expected to see," he said, his gaze steady, "not what was actually there." And the words settled into the space between them, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, and Daniel felt them land, not as accusation but as truth, the kind that did not raise its voice because it did not need to. And around them the employees remained still, the customers silent, the entire store suspended in a moment that no longer belonged to routine or procedure, but to something far more human, something uncomfortable and unavoidable. And Isaiah remained where he was for a second longer before Nathaniel turned back toward him, offering a hand without hesitation, not pulling, not rushing, simply offering. And Isaiah looked at it briefly, then up again, and with a slow, steady motion he accepted, rising carefully, his movements measured but strong enough to carry him upright. And when he stood, there was no rush of triumph, no outward display of victory, only a quiet return to presence, a reclaiming of space that had never truly been his to lose. And Nathaniel adjusted his stance slightly beside him, not in front, not above, but beside, aligning himself without needing to announce it. And Daniel watched, the implications settling in with increasing clarity, each second stripping away another layer of certainty he had relied on, until all that remained was the undeniable contrast between what he had assumed and what now stood plainly before him. And he lowered his gaze for just a fraction of a second before lifting it again. The shift subtle but significant, the first sign that something within him had begun to change, even if he did not yet fully understand how or why. And in that aisle, under the same cold lights, surrounded by the same shelves and silent witnesses, the balance of power had not been overturned with force or confrontation, but with something far quieter, far stronger, something that could not be undone once seen. And the room, once filled with judgment, now held something else entirely, something closer to realization. Daniel did not speak right away, and that silence, coming from someone who had filled the room with authority just moments ago, felt louder than anything he could have said, his posture no longer rigid but slightly lowered, as if the weight of the moment had settled onto his shoulders in a way he had not anticipated, and his eyes moved from Nathaniel to Isaiah and then back again, not searching for answers anymore, but confronting something he could no longer ignore. And when he finally inhaled, it was slower than before, measured, as if even the act of breathing required more thought than it had a few minutes earlier. "I may have misjudged the situation," he said, the words careful, deliberate, not rehearsed but chosen, and they landed softly in the space between them, not as a defense but as an admission that did not come easily, and the employees nearby shifted slightly, exchanging glances that carried both surprise and uncertainty, because this was not the tone they were used to hearing, not from him, not in this place. And Daniel continued, his voice quieter now, stripped of the certainty that had once defined it. There was no confirmation, only assumption. And the word lingered, heavier than any accusation he had made earlier, because now it pointed inward rather than outward, and Nathaniel watched him, not interrupting, not pushing, simply allowing the moment to unfold, his expression steady, his presence grounded. And Isaiah stood beside him, his coat still worn, his posture still marked by the weight of years, yet something about him felt different now, not changed, but seen, and that alone altered the way the room held him. And Daniel took a small step forward, closing just enough distance to make his next words feel personal rather than procedural. "Sir," he said, this time directed to Isaiah, his tone respectful in a way that had not been there before. "I am sorry." And the apology was simple, without embellishment, without explanation, because anything more would have weakened it. And for a moment no one reacted, not immediately, because apologies, real ones, had a way of creating space rather than filling it. And Isaiah looked at him quietly, not with resentment, not with visible judgment, but with a calm that suggested he had seen moments like this before, moments where realization arrived too late to undo what had already been done but still mattered in ways that could not be dismissed. And he nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion that did not erase the past few minutes but acknowledged the present. And Nathaniel shifted slightly, his attention returning to Isaiah, his voice softer now, grounded in something more personal. "You should not have had to go through that," he said, not as an accusation toward Daniel, but as a statement of truth. And Isaiah's eyes met his again, and for a second there was something like a smile, faint and restrained, not of joy but of understanding, the kind that came from knowing life rarely moved in straight lines. And Nathaniel reached up slowly, removing his coat, the fabric dark and well-tailored, and without hesitation he placed it gently over Isaiah's shoulders, adjusting it just enough to sit properly, not as a gesture meant to be seen, but as something instinctive, something that came from a place deeper than the moment itself. And Isaiah allowed it, his hands briefly touching the fabric as if grounding himself in its weight. And around them the store began to breathe again, slowly, cautiously, the hum of machines returning, the subtle movement of carts resuming. But nothing felt the same, not entirely, because something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. And Daniel stepped back, giving space without being told, his expression quieter now, reflective, as if he was replaying the moment in his mind with a different understanding. And no one spoke further, because there was nothing left to clarify, nothing left to defend, only the quiet presence of what had been revealed. And in that aisle, under the same unchanging lights, something deeper than order had taken its place, something that did not rely on rules or assumptions, but on recognition. And once seen, it did not disappear. They did not leave immediately, not because they did not know where to go, but because the moment itself seemed to ask for stillness, for something quieter than movement. And Nathaniel remained beside Isaiah, not guiding him, not directing him, just present, his hand resting lightly at his father's back as if reminding him that he did not have to stand alone anymore. And Isaiah's shoulders, though still carrying the weight of years, seemed to settle just slightly beneath the coat draped over them. the fabric unfamiliar yet grounding, and his gaze moved slowly across the store, not searching for anyone in particular, but taking in the space that had, only minutes ago, reduced him to something smaller than he was, and now stood silent in the wake of its own realization, and the people around them began to look away, not out of dismissal but out of reflection, as if each person carried a quiet awareness of what they had witnessed and what it meant, and Daniel remained near the aisle. No longer at the center, no longer directing, his hands lowered at his sides, his posture softened into something more human, more uncertain, his eyes following the two figures without interruption, and for a moment it seemed as though he might speak again, might attempt to add something more, but he did not, because some moments did not need more words, they needed space. And across the store the steady rhythm of everyday life began to return, the distant beep of a register, the low hum of conversation, the soft roll of cart wheels against polished floors, all of it resuming carefully, as if testing whether the world could continue without undoing what had just been seen. And Nathaniel finally turned slightly, his voice low, meant only for Isaiah. "Let us get you somewhere warm," he said, not as a command but as an offering, and Isaiah nodded once, his movements measured but steady, and together they began to walk, not quickly, not with urgency, but with a quiet purpose that did not need to announce itself. Their steps aligned without effort, and as they moved through the aisle the space around them opened naturally, not out of obligation but out of recognition, the same people who had once watched now stepping aside, creating a path that had not existed before, and the automatic doors at the front of the store slid open once more, letting in a breath of cooler air that brushed gently against their faces, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and something else, something cleaner, something new. And as they reached the threshold, Isaiah paused for just a second, turning his head slightly back toward the store, not to look at anyone in particular, but as if acknowledging the moment itself, the unseen line that had been crossed. And then he stepped forward, crossing into the open air beside his son, the two of them moving into a space that felt wider, quieter, untouched by the assumptions left behind, and behind them the doors closed softly, sealing the moment inside, leaving only its echo in the minds of those who remained. And Daniel stood there a while longer, unmoving, his reflection faintly visible in the glass of a nearby refrigerator case, his expression thoughtful, not defeated but changed, as if something within him had shifted just enough to alter the way he would see the next moment, the next person, the next decision. And he exhaled slowly, the breath steady but heavier than before turning back toward the store, not to resume as he had, but to move forward with something new, something unspoken but present. And outside, under a sky softened by passing clouds, Nathaniel and Isaiah walked side by side, their pace unhurried, their silence no longer empty but full, carrying with it years of distance and the quiet beginning of something restored. And there were no grand gestures, no declarations, no need to prove what had already been revealed, only the simple truth of two figures moving forward together, their shadows stretching faintly across the pavement, steady and unbroken, as the world continued around them, unchanged and yet, in a small and quiet way, entirely